Good afternoon. My name is Ioannis Lianos, and I'm the president of the Hellenic Competition Commission. I'm actually here to introduce the webinar of the Hellenic Competition Commission on ecosystems and competition law. We have a very interesting panel to have a discussion on a number of issues. The first issue we'd like to explore is the specificity of ecosystem competition as opposed to simple market competition, the existence of a possible gap in current competition law tools for assessing anti-competitive conduct in the context of ecosystems, how to measure ecosystem power and possible metrics, and how to deal with the various business models emerging in ecosystems. With us today, we have the pleasure of having the company of Professor Frederic, President of the Competition Committee of the OECD, Professor Economides from the Leonard Stern School of Business at NYU, Professor Michael Jacobides from London Business School, Professor Geoffrey Parker from Dartmouth Engineering University, Professor Petropoulos from MIT Sloan School of Management and Bruegel, Dr. Bruno Carballa Smichowski of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, Professor Konstantinos Stylianou of the University of Leeds. So it's a great pleasure to have a group of excellent colleagues and friends to discuss this exciting issue. And the reason actually for this discussion is the new Article 2A of the Greek Competition Law Bill, which establishes a provision concerning the abuse of power, opposition of power in an ecosystem of structural importance to competition. Obviously, we'll focus on this specific provision, but we'll also discuss the broader context at the European Union level, but also at the member state level concerning these type of provisions that are aimed to deal with ecosystem power. So what is a few words of introduction? What is the purpose of this provision? So this provision aims to foster innovation and to protect the final consumer's long-term interests. This will be achieved by enabling the smaller but efficient and innovative ecosystems that are active in the Greek markets to compete with larger ones on more equal terms. In addition to enhancing competition, this will also allow medium-sized or even larger undertakings that are active in the Greek markets and which are complementers in ecosystems to better protect their interests and realize more value from their involvement in larger global ecosystems, such as those that have been created by big international platforms. So this will actually help them to preserve their incentives to invest in innovation and sharpen their competitiveness further. So obviously, you know that the digital age has shown a spotlight on online intermediaries and digital platforms that control and organize highly valuable ecosystems. And such ecosystems do not only offer products and services, but also provide the technical infrastructure and tools through which new products and even platforms can be developed. As a result, new issues of competition have arisen, where undertakings hold a position of power in the market by dint of their status as gatekeepers of ecosystems. This implies that they can impose abusive practices on other participants in these ecosystems, the complementers. These weaker participants may be locked in, finding themselves caught in a web of technological and financial dependency, as well as the structure of the ecosystem itself. This leaves them powerless to resist or limit the anti-competitive outcomes resulting from abusive practices. So the power of the ecosystem orchestrator is enhanced inter alia by their ability to take advantage of big data and frequently AI tools. They use these technological tools to extract surplus from customers actually, they're customers of the ecosystem, they're complementers in a certain way, because this is about economic complements, co-creating value, and exploit their pivotal position in multi-sided platforms by imposing restrictive and potentially anti-competitive conditions. And these strategies obviously can be observed in digital ecosystems, but have also expanded into non-digital or hybrid ecosystems. So it is important actually to highlight that ecosystems as defined in this law include various companies and nexus of dependency and should be distinguished from conventional vertical relationships between actors and supply chains. The actors that form an ecosystem are independently owned, but financially and technologically interconnected due to highly complementary relationships between the resources needed to participate in this ecosystem. The fact that the user or group of users are provided with a coherent and often financially integrated offering, even though multiple actors are involved. Relatedly, there are positive or negative feedback loops between the different categories of users. And often the sunk cost that complementors may invest for a seat at the table, which may result in them being locked in. This may raise an issue in as much as the scope and extent of the ecosystem is such that potential ecosystem participants will be materially worse off if they chose not to participate in the ecosystem. This may be, for instance, the case if the ecosystem in question is based on a key technological platform, which constitutes a central point for the harvesting of data, the management of incentives for the coordination of the ecosystem. And therefore, this is an important characteristic of the more problematic ecosystems, of important direct and indirect network effects that give them influence and power over participants across different markets. So the issues actually that are addressed by Article 2.8 are obviously not new. They are recognized by a number of other jurisdictions. Obviously, we all know of the example of Germany, which has already moved to a proposal addressing, and legislation actually, addressing the above issues in the 10th review of its competition law, the new Article 19a. And this applies a new provision regarding undertakings with paramount significance for competition across markets. Similar initiatives have passed as legislation in Austria and are in discussion in Italy. Elsewhere, we also have the retour, I would say, of some oldies, like the abuse of economic dependence, that could also be used in order to tackle this issue. For instance, the recent Belgian competition legislation deals with the abuse of a relationship of economic dependence. And justifying this law, Belgian legislators made specific reference to the legislative gap concerning digital platforms. French competition authority have also applied provisions for the abuse of economic dependence, which form part of their rule book of free and not only unfair competition to non-dominant firms in the market. And of course, we have a number of other jurisdictions in Europe. Actually, there are almost 15 jurisdictions out of the 27 that have actually provisions on non-structural market power, which I include there, of course, the provisions concerning ecosystems, also provisions concerning abuse of economic dependence, and provisions concerning relative market power, which are there in order to deal with some of the issues raised by, it could actually be dealing with some of the issues raised by digital platforms and digital ecosystems, or more broadly, ecosystems. Also, the European Commission has been highlighting the issues that are raised from anti-competitive activity in the context of ecosystems. Of course, the experts' report in 2019, compiled for the European Commission, somehow focused on the concept, introduced the concept of ecosystems. It suggested that when undertakings capture consumers and they find it difficult to exit a particular ecosystem, the existence of ecosystem-specific aftermarkets shall be presumed. In the United Kingdom, of course, we have had the report of the special committee appointed by the Ministry of Finance and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy that actually put forward this idea of ecosystem strategic market position. Of course, there has been discussion about ecosystems in the European Commission's inquiry into the Internet of Things, which has used this term rather than the term of market to denote the field of competition for the Internet of Things and for such systems. So with the introduction of Article 2A, the idea is that the Greek competition authority will have the ability to impose, to find an infringement in the context of this abuse of ecosystem power, in the context of ecosystems of paramount importance. And I would say the idea is to use this specific provision to deal with situations of where we have a company without a dominant position in a specific market, but which actually has an important position of power due to the fact that it is present in various markets which are interconnected to a certain extent and that form an ecosystem, interconnected and largely interdependent, basically, economic activities that are carried out by these different undertakings. So in order to enhance legal certainty, we have followed a number of steps in the context of this legislation. First, of course, the Competition Commission must prove that the particular entity is an undertaking, therefore that there is an economic entity with economic activities. Secondly, the Competition Commission must prove that the particular activities form an ecosystem. And we include in the text of the law a definition of an ecosystem. So obviously, ecosystem is defined as, firstly, a nexus of interconnected and to a great extent interdependent economic activities of different undertakings aiming at the provision of products or services which impact on the same group of users, or a platform connecting economic activities of different undertakings with the purpose of providing one or more of products or services affecting either the same users or different groups of business users or end users. So the first, let's say, part of the definition concerns situation that could until now be dealt under the concept of aftermarkets, although we think that the concept of ecosystem is a more elegant way to deal with the problems that arise in this context. And the second part of the definition about platforms actually concerns platforms in a multi-sided market context, but more general, let's say, a platform intermediary. So, and of course, you know, this definition of ecosystems could be built upon in the context of guidelines that we aim to adopt should the law be adopted by the Parliament. So, and of course, you know, the third step will be for the Competition Commission to prove that the particular ecosystem is of paramount importance for competition in Greece. The reason for this is twofold. First, you know, we need to identify the ratione loci, that this is a fundamental for competition in the Greek dominion, therefore bringing the issue under the jurisdiction of the Hellenic Competition Commission. And secondly, it serves as a condition of ratione materia of the violation. The Commission must investigate whether there is inter-ecosystem competition or inter-brand competition. And only if there is no sufficient inter-ecosystem or inter-brand competition can the Commission proceed to the next stage and investigate whether the particular undertaking has a dominant position, has a position of power in the particular ecosystem. Therefore, if the ecosystem is not of paramount importance for competition, its existence, for instance, does not play a significant role in affecting the ability of the consumer or potential consumer or the supplier to choose between different competitive offers, the law enforcers shall not proceed further. And actually, the law includes in paragraph 4 a number of criteria which help us to identify the situations in which there is a structural importance to competition. And actually, we are presuming that an ecosystem is of structural importance to competition, where non-participation in it substantially affects the effective exercise of business activity by third parties. And when determining the ecosystem's structural importance to competition, we take into account of different elements: the economic power of the significant share of the ecosystems concerned in the total turnover or in the revenue of one or more sectors of the Greek economy, its access to substantial resources, in particular the significant number of business users depending on the ecosystems in order to connect with end users or to sensitive data and information relevant to competition, and the significance of its activities with regard to the access of third parties to procurement and sales markets in the Greek territory. So notwithstanding the fulfillment of the requirements stipulated in these in the previous elements that I actually discussed, an ecosystem shall be presumed to lack structural importance to competition where at least 4 other independent ecosystems operate in parallel to it, and such ecosystems constitute a viable alternative for users. So the fourth step here is, of course, for the Commission to prove that the particular undertaking has a position of power in the specific ecosystem. So once we identified that there is, we are dealing with an ecosystem of paramount importance, we need to look to the situation of the specific undertaking and see if it holds a position of power in the particular ecosystem. And the concept of the position of power here is similar to that we have in Article 102 or Article 2 of our law. It relates to the undertaking that has the power of independent behavior and is allowed to run without considering its competitors or suppliers. Of course, since the dominant position here is not in a market, but in an ecosystem, its calculation can be different to that of Article 2 or 102, since the dominant position is not judged primarily on market share, but on other parameters that are closer to the concept of power within the ecosystem. And among the important parameters that must be taken into consideration is the centrality of the company in the ecosystem and the extent to which it fulfills its role as orchestrator, imposing the trade and technological parameters that must be followed by the other companies involved in the ecosystem, technological advantages and the acquisition of control points that are difficult or impossible to be acquired by other undertakings active in the ecosystem. So the inclusion of other parameters does not mean that the concept of the dominant position of Article 2 changes conceptually, or Article 102 changes conceptually. Rather, it is simply enriched with new factors. So to a certain extent, I think this is an important element in the new law. So the fifth step would be for the Competition Commission to prove that the particular undertaking abuse its position of power. Here, in accordance with Article 2, the legal burden of proof lies with the Competition Commission. But as in Article 2, the evidential burden of proof for objective justifications lies with the dominant undertaking. I have to say also that the law recognizes the importance of objective justifications, and in particular, business models to a certain extent, as elements that need to be taken into account when assessing the specific ecosystem and the specific undertakings conduct. Actually, so this offers more flexibility than the DMA approach, and of course, because there's a case-by-case analysis of objective justification, it is among it can be considered as competition law ex post provision, and therefore does not create any conflict with the Digital Markets Act. So we do think that the concept of abuse in this context will be exactly the same as the concept of abuse that we have for Article 102 or Article 2. Actually, there is a cross-fertilization that will happen from the case law on Article 2 and 102. Therefore, the undertakings, knowing that their conduct is compatible with Article 2 or Article 102, will somehow be in a safe area. Also, with regards to the application of Article 2A, what actually changes here is the field of competition that we take into account in order to assess power, rather than the type of conduct. That's why also we don't have a list of examples of possible anti-competitive conduct in this article, as is, for instance, the case of Article 19A in Germany, which is not exactly an ex post somehow provision, but an ex nunc somehow competition law provision. In order to somehow promote legal certainty, we take a number of precautions. Firstly, the provision is enforced only by the competition authority without any scope of private enforcement, excluding, of course, the possibility to receive damages in case of a violation after a relevant finding by the Competition Commission. The provision does not impose any fines or other monetary sanctions upon the finding that there is an abuse of ecosystem power in an ecosystem of paramount importance for competition in Greece. Actually, the law takes into account fully regulatory dialogue by basically distinguishing the first phase, which is the finding of infringement. Then this is followed by a discussion and regulatory dialogue with the specific company, which can offer commitments. And of course, the Commission might take a decision that enforces the commitments of the specific company. It's only if the undertaking doesn't follow the commitments that a fine may be imposed. So the whole idea is actually to have an approach that is very much based on regulatory process of regulatory dialogue. And of course, in order to enhance even more legal certainty, the Competition Commission is required to publish at the latest within 6 months of the date that this provision is put in the force guidelines about defining the various concepts. And actually, it's quite important to have in mind here that it's only after 6 months that the guidelines have been adopted that this specific provision may be implemented. So that gives ample time for the transition to this new regime and provides important legal certainty. So I think this is a kind of a short presentation of the specific provision. I have to say that from our perspective, it's a quite important rule because for Greece, because of the fact that Greece is a complementous country. Obviously, the idea here is to incentivize our complementars to make investments and participate in ecosystems. This provision is very much linked to another provision we have adopted on Article 37A of the law, which concerns no action enforcement letters in order to promote cooperation between firms, in particular small and medium firms, for sustainable development reasons, in order to create ecosystems. So the idea is we somehow try to help the transition of the economy, the green transition of the economy, the digital transition of the economy, which is characterized by a number of small and medium firms. Actually, almost more than 80% of the firms in Greece have less than 9 employees. And to enhance them and enable them to, through the development of ecosystems, to reach the scale. But at the same time, we want to make sure that the orchestrators of these ecosystems will not take advantage of their central position and exploit the independent companies that have contributed with their work to the ecosystem establishment and development. So we look forward to your comments on this specific provision, and the idea here is to have a discussion about this specific provision and how actually it relates to other initiatives at the EU level and at the national level. So, but I will actually pass the floor now to Michael Jacobides, who has been one of the co-drafters of this legislation, in order to come in and explain the specificity of ecosystem competition as opposed to simple market competition, which forms in a certain way the ratio legis of this specific provision. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Now, how much time do I have?
You have 10 to 12 minutes.
Right. Okay. Well, in that case, I think that my slides are going to be rather useless in trying to walk through. I guess that the problem here that we're trying to address is one where the nature of the problem is probably different from the nature of the problem of other dominant firms. And I guess that this splits into 2 periods. I will do this perhaps somewhat foolish effort in the case that I thought that I had a bit more time, but let me share some slides. I mean, it isn't only the problem that you've got these big ecosystems, and the reason that I'm showing this, which is the ecosystem, this goes about, shows the volume of digital of the digital advertising industry and how a very small number of companies outside this sector dominate the traditional news brands or broadcasters. But basically, it shows that as we are seeing this transformation, the transformation is that people start being mediated by ecosystems, and this comes from one of the other well-known ecosystems, and that are trying to create worlds around them. Now, what makes it interesting is that we are increasingly seeing that in a smaller scale. And I think that the problems that we want to ensure do not happen are not only the fact that you will create the lock-ins, and usually you see organizations that engage in significant activity in terms of relationships and mergers and acquisitions. Essentially, that showed you and financial. And here you can see the M&A, large and small, joint ventures, minority investments, alliances, multi-party alliances that underpin that, which is interesting because the question is whether you need to start thinking about the focus on how to block it. And I know that Jeff Parker will have to speak about that. But the issues in a macro level is, of course, that as Dick Thaler notes in his research, that you have some firms that become the default. So the problem is that we have a set of the behavioral predispositions that customers have that we know and are well documented, and that technology offers both production economics that are peculiar, i.e. it allows you to scale in ways that do not have the same ratios that you had in the past, as well as gives you the incentives of creating these ever-expanding webs. And anyone who is looking at any part of the what is now called the experience economy is going to see that you have these webs of things that are offered as a package because they are consumed better, and also they create issues that relate to the position of ensuring that things go around, and that creates a possibility of some firms that are building ecosystems that they are able to leverage. And I think that Booking.com, and this is a very specific point, and I think that it is going to be interesting to hear Frederic Genie's view about that, is the question of how do we define who is a gatekeeper, because in the European level, we have regulation that is focused with some numerical figures that essentially aims at big tech, but still allows ecosystem activity to happen elsewhere. And we do have power that is exerted, not only in organizations like Booking.com, but many others at the smaller scale, which neither can be seen in the context of one market, nor do they necessarily go in the context of the existing framework. And I think that in the context of us saying, well, what do we need to do? We need to probably move beyond where we were. Now, let me fast forward here a little bit. Before fast forwarding, I'd say that Ioannis, Lianos, co-authored a special issue where we're trying to explore a number of these issues, and that the law that we have drafted is in the context of an effort to create a structure that addresses the problem itself. And it's been fascinating to have as our fellow travelers people, including many of those who have been invited today, in looking at different facets of the regulation of platforms and ecosystems. Drawing on the paper that we wrote with Ioannis that I think underpinned some of the thinking here, what we have seen is that, as Ioannis mentioned, and that is the reason why this law is here, that you cannot put the types of dependence that emerge in ecosystems under the existing structures. And we think that this is fine. And the point that we're trying to make is that this has happened in competition law, as we have seen competition law address more complex economic dependence and abuse of position issues that have expanded its vocabulary. And that we are thinking that this focus on ecosystem expands the vocabulary, and rather than stretching the existing constructs to capture things that we already know, the focus on the ecosystems, primarily digital, although not exclusively, is starting to address different types of dominant effects, potential competition issues, nature of interaction, but also, and that's a very important part about the law, the way we constructed it, a focus on practices. This law is not made to be punitive. This law is made to identify practices as and if and when they occur. And this is a very interesting issue in terms of the way that we approach it, because if you look, let me move away from the options. If you look at the way that we have seen things emerge so far, there's either a school of thought that would say, it's stuff that we already know. Look at the existing conventional competition framework, but we see that increasingly there is an unease with the idea, and then people say, fine, let us ensure that in order to deal with these ecosystems, we create some laws on what you're allowed and what you're not allowed to do ex ante, which essentially are a sort of bottled version of antitrust gripe with some of the big tech. And it's interesting because what the things that we don't want to see there are primarily things that Google, Facebook, occasionally Amazon, sometimes Microsoft is doing, and we intellectualize it and we say, we don't want that. We've seen it. It's not terribly good. It's a practice that we don't like. And because we know we're really speaking about a few big firms, we also in Europe say, okay, we're going to put a really high threshold of 6.5 billion or 65 billion. I mean, these are very big numbers that show that there are some firms, and anyone who looks at the stock market understands that that is the case, that are really taking all the value that is created in the digital world. Our approach is closer to what has started happening, and that Ioannis was speaking about earlier on, which is to complement rules that have to do with the architecture of activities, which we think are interesting, but may be a bit of a sledgehammer and also have the risk that they are being applied to only the ginormous companies, a very important element, but not the whole story, but rather that we focus on the abuse in a ecosystem of structural importance. And that is relevant because essentially what happens, I'm going to give you a rather politically incorrect story. I'm doing a case study in Sberbank, and I was looking at some of the strategy documents, and Sber says, hey, I have 98 million customers, and look at the valuation of the people who have ecosystems. And literally for that, they said, I'm going to buy anything that smells like a platform or a marketplace. I'm going to put it together. I'm going to build an ecosystem because banking doesn't have money anymore. But if I lock people in, I'll be able to squeeze it. And it's really interesting to see how some dominant players are trying to say that they will be able to create an advantage by these lock-ins that may be anti-competitive. Now, part of it is something that we do not think will be able to be addressable. Part of it might be, unfortunately, these are our predispositions, and people may end up paying a supernormal profit to companies that do that. On the other hand, what we're trying to see is what are the practices, once we have established that these ecosystems are problematic, that we're going to be focusing on. And some of them may have to do with things that are discussed in general, such as the ease of interconnection, which is an absolutely essential piece. And you can see in areas that we have pushed for these, like in payments with PSD2 in the European Union, how much we have both lower prices and innovation, because we have a set of rules that allow greater interconnection. And similarly, I think that the effort here is to think about remedies that essentially address the issues that are not only issues of harm to the final customer, but also issues of harm to the complementers and potential innovators. So the idea behind the issues that we're looking at is that we want to protect innovation. We want to protect these companies that come up with cool new ways of doing stuff, rather than allowing whatever firm dominates one sector and then wants to expand around, like Airbnb does with experiences, like, a big health group that will decide that they're going to give you wellness solutions. And then they choose how the trainers or other providers of complementary services are going to hook up with that to have a tool. And the tool is very important because the current framework, certainly in the countries, and that's another important distinction, that there are some countries that have tools to deal with economic dependence and some that do not. Greece used to have it, and then it says, this has been abused, I'll take it out. Now, the countries that have it can sort of fit ecosystems in their provisions about economic dependence, but countries like Greece that do not face the problem that this cannot happen. And we think that especially for countries where you want to have greater innovation and more competition, you need to have that. And, I think that this is particularly interesting. We had an interesting session with the Association of Greek Industrialists. And I think that, our view was that rather than thinking about a competition regulation that might have a chilling effect in investment, it would have a supportive effect in investment. What we know, there's a nice recent paper by Jos Redveld and others, is that when complementers become dominant, they start being much more abusive and exploitative orchestrators become dominant, they become much more abusive of their complementers. So the concern that we have is that in an area which does not yet have the sophistication in the digital sphere that allows for these ecosystems to emerge, you might have a few players that will end up ruling the economy and setting their terms. And what the literature suggests is that, unfortunately, the ability that they have to do so soon translates into the real exercise of this exploitative power. So what we're trying to do is to find the juste milieu, as it were, where we need, as a competition authority, to be able to pinpoint what the issues are and behaviorally ask to redress them, as opposed to have a sledgehammer where there is a regulator that goes about, I think, either issuing penalties or having sort of horizontal blocks. So that's the context, both intellectually and pragmatically. But I think that the questions and the contribution of the other colleagues who are not party to this effort and who have a more outside view is probably more valuable than me spending any more time on that. So with this, let me stop sharing and cede the floor to whomever will take it next.
Thank you very much, Michael. So I will now pass the floor to George Parker, who might want to share his insights on the way ecosystems break with the current understandings that we have based on the classical price theory and competition, and maybe focus on the way we can address platforms and their business models. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'll start with the points. So first of all, welcome everyone. You sent some talking points, Michael, so that was very helpful. Let's just first think about the specificity of ecosystem competition as opposed to simple market competition. I think it's useful to go back and just think about where the value resides, because any of these proposed regulatory solutions are going to have a direct impact on that. And so if you think about platforms and the ways that they create value for users, a lot of it will just be straight, what does the system do? And so that'll fit in kind of a lot of these Internet of Things technologies, cloud services, the hyperscalers. But a lot of it also resides in network effects in a few different flavors. So there are these collaborative systems where they're fully dependent upon the number of users that are like you. That fits pretty much social media. There are these access to markets and ecosystem developers. So that fits kind of the innovation networks like SAP or any of the operating systems. And then there are also sort of a variation on a theme of the data-driven network effects. And so the challenge you've got is, 100 years ago, you could take a look at one of these very large, transportation network firms or oil firms and just break them up. And the assumption there was that the sum of the value would continue to remain the same that was available on the market. The challenge here is that you're very likely to have a value destruction, or at least you have the potential for that. And so that kind of brings us to this gap in law that I think, listening to Ioannis and listening to Michael, you can kind of see where these are struggling. And in particular, you have this notion of a well-defined market. And again, this notion of a standalone value that you can dice and slice these organizations and then add them back together and have them equal the original sum. Neither of those are particularly true. We see competition arising from adjacent markets. We don't know necessarily how they're assessing or having an impact on those adjacencies. And take advertising, for example. Michael's, I think, slide is pretty compelling, and you can see the amount of market power. And then at one level, you'd say, well, why does it matter? All of the services that those firms are providing are free to consumers. But of course, that's nonsense. You know that on the advertising side, there's significant market power, and then the prices are a lot higher than they would have been otherwise. And so incorporating those adjacencies, I think, is really important for the competition authorities. And then you asked us to talk a bit about how to measure that power. And I think one kind of image that you might hold in your head of these platform ecosystems is you've got this kind of star network with the platform as central node. And then the value the platform brings to the ecosystem tells you essentially to what extent the actors that are in that star system depend on the platform. And so, one definition we've used, other than just turnover, is a very generic one. You'd call it a platform of high economic dependence. And the first best measure would be to have some notion of the interaction intensity across all the nodes among the users. And those aren't necessarily transactions, because you could be depending upon that system to power your ability, your operating models, your ability to actually create value. And that would require potentially a pretty intrusive view, and you might end up having to have almost a lighthouse, if you will, of competition authorities residing inside of these platforms so that they can actually observe the intensity of transaction across the different connected parties. And you should certainly have some reporting requirement so that the platforms can actually disclose the number of interactions that they facilitate. And then that audit function would be able to assess if that's a truthful report. Whether the competition authorities will have the infrastructure to actually kind of play, if you will, that role is an area you'd end up having to invest in, and you'll have a lot more insight, Ioannis, to that than I will. But at least a very gross measure is to look at the user bases. But I do think this kind of intensity of API usage and connection usage is really important. And to provide a little evidence for that, I did a kind of a fireside chat for a project with the head of ecosystem for HubSpot, which is a tech firm here in Boston. And I said, what's the one thing you look at? Because you usually have a couple of metrics. He said, look, the only thing that really matters in my world is not the integrations that third parties do to connect to us, but the intensity of their usage. And so that suggests that, from his point of view, it's a much stickier system. So he's become much more economically important in that star node if the actors who are connected are hitting it on a daily basis or on an hourly basis. And so that's his metric, but that suggests that if he's driving his own business that way, that's a pretty good one for external observers to spend some time looking at as well. And in terms of how do you deal with all this, I mean, we were fortunate to be part of this special issue, which is really a nice compendium, and lots of ideas. I mean, we focused that on mergers, and so in the paper we put forward some ideas on which mergers don't need a whole lot of scrutiny because they make sense prima facie on an efficiency basis. Other ones would raise concerns, and I think you would, in effect, impose some kind of a burden of proof on the proposed parties that would say, this looks like it could be anti-competitive, so you actually need to prove that this makes sense on an efficiency basis. Otherwise, we would assume that that's a prohibited merger and activity. And that idea more broadly goes to, if you look at the Digital Markets Act, they spent a lot of time talking about what you couldn't do, but they didn't leave open a lot of a lot of room for where efficiency gains might overturn these presumed anti-competitive behaviors. And so I think we would say, yeah, you might call those gray list activities where on the face of it, you'd say no, you wouldn't want to permit those, but with appropriate analysis and review, you might be able to make some kind of an efficiency argument. And then I'll let Yorgos kind of handle. We have a whole host of things around data portability and how to improve access, but we've been working jointly on these projects, so I'm not gonna take all that.
Thank you very much, Jet. That has been very helpful. And of course, you know, as you mentioned before, I mean, the how you take into account efficiencies and possible project justifications, I think is probably one of the added value of this law, which provides more flexibility than the DMA, which is actually an ex-ante regulation. Of course, is more difficult to do this type of case-by-case analysis. I will turn now to Frederic Geny, who could provide his insights on the existence of a regulatory gap, critically assess in a way how this has been so far addressed by the DMA, other national competitional provisions, what he thinks about the Greek initiative in this context, the Greek proposal. And of course, you know, his insights will be, as always, very welcome. Frederic, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ioannis, for this. Okay, let me start with the fact that what we have in competition law field, what we have heard are a lot of complaints by complementers in ecosystems about the way in which the core platforms treated them, either exploiting them or sometimes competing unfairly with them. And I would say that most of the cases that we have dealt with are along those lines. There is also, of course, a concern about the fact that the merger policy of large platform may stifle innovation by swallowing up young innovators and preventing them from competing with the established large platforms. Now, the concern has been that competition authorities have not done a very good job on those issues because they have failed to see some or to fight some practices which were considered to be unfair and or anti-competitive. And one of the questions, of course, is why it is that we have a competition law enforcement failure. So we may have a competition failure, but we also seem to have a competition law enforcement failure. And from this discussion is a subsequent discussion about how can we fix this? And there are different ways in which one can think about fixing it. There are at least 4 ways that I can think of. One of them is to add a traditional type of regulation. This is the kind of DMA solution on top possibly of competition law to try to fill the missing gaps. The other one is more like the UK proposal, which is kind of a B-scope regulation, a regulation which would be in fact case by case, or at least would have an important element of case by case analysis. The third solution has been, which has been requested by a number of European competition authorities, is to have instruments that would allow them to take interim measures or to negotiate commitments, even if they didn't have a case. So those kind of regulatory tools that would be put in the hands of the competition authorities and would allow them to, in fact, regulate in some way in the name of competition law, the sector. And finally, there is the expansion of the scope of competition law. For example, I mean, you've talked quite a bit about abuse of dependency or abuse of negotiating power as being one element which does not exist in the Greek law, but would be useful in this context. Now, it seems to me that the first thing is, of course, to try to figure out where the gap comes from and why the competition authorities have not been able to deal with the issues. And I think there are 3 or 4 elements which we should keep in mind. The fact that artificial intelligence is a technology which allows large organizations which are able to treat large amounts of data to better target their services to the needs of the consumers. So this leads to a situation where bigness, size, leads to better performance, which leads to concentration, and which leads possibly to competition problems. Now, the specificity of this is that there may be a link between superior efficiency and superior market power. And in which case, how do we separate the two? How do we get the benefit of superior efficiency without getting the problem of superior market power? The second issue, I think, is that it is arguable whether one of the assumptions of competition law, which is that consumers are rational in their choices, they have set preferences, and they try to maximize an objective function, works very well when we talk, on the one hand, about free, or at least services which are not paid directly, and data. And there's a fair amount of evidence coming from behavioral economics, among other things, other places, that it's not very clear that there is a rational behavior on the part of consumers, and that therefore there is not a constraint on the firms of the type that we find in typical competition markets. The third issue is that what Michael has been through, and I'm not going to repeat this, but that competition between ecosystems doesn't work like competition between pipeline firms, and that most of our competition law instruments are useless to analyze competition between ecosystems because they are geared to analyze competition between pipeline firms. So I'm not going to go into this, but the concept of market, the concept of potential entrants, et cetera, needs to be revisited if they are going to be applied or any use when dealing with the digital sector. One point which hasn't been mentioned and which has been bothering me is the fact that there is a direct link between competition within an ecosystem, which is what we're talking about mostly today, and competition between ecosystems. And I'm personally very sensitive to the fact that, for example, if you take the EU decision, the Google Android decision, well, it starts by saying, okay, there is no competition between Apple and Google, so Google has a dominant position, so I can look at whether it has abused its dominant position or not. And it seems to me that the logic of ecosystems is that they aggregate services in a way which allows the ecosystem to overcome the possible potential competition of other ecosystems, and that we are in a situation like a few decades ago, when we were looking at vertical restraints, and we were only looking at intra-brand competition, and we did not realize that reduction of intra-brand competition could lead to more inter-brand competition. Now we've moved away from that around the turn of the century, but I think that we have a bit of integration to do in the analysis of competition within ecosystem and competition between ecosystems. Okay, and finally, of course, the doctrine and the concept of potential competition is not directly applicable in the digital sector, because the possible potential competitors may be doing something entirely different, which can be adapted, but there's a wider scope for potential competition, which has two implications. One of them is that the OFT in the UK was unable to see that Instagram could be a potential competitor to Facebook, and therefore allowed a merger which turned out to be anti-competitive. And likewise, it can also work in reverse. in a case where a platform or an ecosystem seems to be dominant because we don't realize that there are potential competitors who are not directly competing with it today, but could very easily compete tomorrow. So the question is, before we address the issue of what is the best solution, is to first really analyze what is the origin of the failure, and then ask ourselves, can competition law be fixed in this way? And this is clearly what the Greek proposal is trying to do by saying, well, yes, we can fix it by proposing an amendment to the law that will expand a little bit the scope of the goals of the law, because it will allow us to go after what is one dimension of the problem, competition within ecosystems, and the issue of buying power or dependency. Now, I must say, being French, I must be honest with you, and I must tell you that even though it is true that in the French competition law, there is the possibility to go after abuses of dependency, there have been very, very few cases, and those cases have been very problematic because the competition authorities and the courts don't know how to assess dependency. And there's a very good reason. Whenever you have a transaction, you have two parties, each one is dependent on the other. And so we arrive at solutions which are either tautological or never applicable. So I just want to mention that, to say that it is not always so easy to deal with the issue of abuse of dependency. Now, question is, would it be better to try to look at or to go in the direction of a regulation? Now, regulations, first of all, regulations are very diverse. They allow to have goals which are quite separate from the promotion of consumer surplus, whether those are social political objectives, for example, fairness, or other economic objectives besides consumer welfare. They may limit competition, and we have plenty of examples of this. They may correct a competition law failure or allow us to take competition take place. That is, for example, what happens in telecommunication or in the financial sector regulation. So what we would be looking at in this particular case is a type of regulation that would allow us to overcome the difficulty of competition authorities to deal with the issue, the competition law enforcement failure that we have. Now, what are the pros and the cons? I mean, there are several issues. One of them, of course, is that regulation is a much more blunt instrument, because it is usually, unless you have the kind of regulation that is considered in the UK, you have a blunt instrument which is applied more or less across the board. And in the case which we are dealing with, where the economic analysis, the competition analysis is not entirely clear, there is a major risk of, in fact, restricting innovation or having side effects which are going to be negative if you impose over large impositions on firms. And this is one of the arguments against the DMA, which is considering imposing obligations irrespective of what the business model of the different firms is. So we see that the Greek proposal, in which the assessment by the competition authority would take into consideration the business model of the firms, is a much finer and much more adapted way to deal with the issue. One of the advantages of ex-ante regulation, of course, is the fact that it can intervene before there's been any damage, whereas competition law intervenes only after there's been some damage. And the question here, which is raised, is whether the damage is of such magnitude that when it has taken place, there is really the possibility to redress the situation or not. One drawback of regulation is, of course, the fact that the parties do not have all the legal guarantees that they have in a more quasi-judicial setting, which is a setting of competition authorities. So their rights of defense are better protected when it is in the context of the competition law that one tries to fix the problem, rather than by adding a regulation outside of the competition law. Finally, one dimension which has been very much talked about, I think, which has been a bit overblown, is the fact that competition law procedures are longer because the competition authority has to establish a case, and to establish a case, it has to go into a lot of details about the situation. So it's longer than the administrative process of regulation. But I think that this can be fixed also by having a fairly clear mandate for the competition authority and having guidelines on how it's going to interpret its provisions. So there are trade-offs between the two instruments. Personally, I tend to have a tendency to think that competition law should be prevalent because it is a finer instrument, a more relevant instrument, but that requires, of course, that competition law authorities do not keep on doing what they've been always doing, but adjust their instruments to the specificities which have been mentioned by Michael earlier on. Okay. Now, when it comes to the proposal, one thing that I want to warn you on is the fact that one of the extension which is proposed is to go from the concept of market power to the concept of negotiating power. Now, this is, I mean, one has to be careful there because you may have a lot of negotiating power without having a lot of market power. So those are not exactly the same things. So that's something to keep in mind. Having said that, it seems that if there is, as Ioannis was mentioning, good guidelines on the interpretation of both what is either dependency or negotiating power or the kind of power that we're looking at, there may be a case for having an adjustment to the competition law. I finally add what I've already mentioned. I think that in that case, it is going to be quite important for the competition authority to really ask itself, what is the relationship between what I see as the restrictions of competition or the abuse of negotiating power within an ecosystem? How does it impact competition among or between ecosystems? Because I think that it's only the combination of those two effects that is really the issue that we should look at. So with this provision, with this proviso, I would tend to say that rather than having except for the CMA type of regulation, which is a bespoke regulation and which is somewhere which is in between changing competition law and adopting regulation. So I don't mind that kind of regulation, but I would prefer to see the possibility to solve the problem within the competition law. And I think there are means, if we understand clearly what the issues are, there are means to solve the problem within the competition law rather than adding a CMA, a DMA type of regulation on top of the existing competition law. And I think that this is the spirit of the Greek proposal.
Thank you very much, Frederic, and also for the points you made about, that this provision should not end up being an abuse of economic dependence provision. Actually, that's not the purpose of this provision. I will say this is a more targeted approach that, as you've seen in the text of the law, takes fully account of inter-ecosystem competition. so the competition between ecosystems. Actually, it even establishes a safe harbor for that level of between ecosystem competition, and obviously addresses the issue of intra-ecosystem competition once we have identified the existence of no sufficient inter-ecosystem competition. And of course, the idea of intra-ecosystem competition is not is not at all related to bargaining, the bargaining position. Actually, the idea of centrality is a much more, I would say, targeted definition of power than what actually we have under a bargaining relational context, where we just see the relation between two parties and we just try to see which of the two has more bargaining power than the other. I think the concept of intra-ecosystem power based on centrality is more a topographical, let's say, approach to a positional power, I would say, approach that is not related to the bargaining, bilateral bargaining, I would say. It's much more...
Yanis, can I add one thing which I forgot? I mean,
sure.
The
Yes.
reaction to what you just said. One has to be mindful of the fact that the interests of the complementers may not be entirely aligned, or not maybe always aligned, with the interests of consumers.
Absolutely.
And I think that this is an important dimension. When you made your initial speech, you said, well, we're trying to work something that would be in the interest of the consumers as well.
Exactly, that's the point.
And I think that this is very important to keep in mind to avoid the trap of maximizing competition or fairness in the relationship between platform and complementary.
That's not the purpose of this legislation. So as I mentioned before, we are looking to the interests of complementers to the extent that this is compatible with the long-term interests of consumers. That I mentioned long-term because here the purpose is the objective is to promote innovation. And that is really what is of interest to us. We want to move forward to a more open, let's say, economy, and having open ecosystems in that economy is extremely important for us. Try to avoid, let's say, a few players, as Michael mentioned before, to basically be in a position to control the whole economy, which also raises issues broader than economic efficiency or consumer welfare, but also about economic democracy, etc., which I think obviously are interrelated. So thank you very much again, Fred. Very interesting remarks. So I'll now pass the floor to George Petropoulos, who may also share his insights about the DMA and the Greek competition law proposal from a competition policy perspective. George, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, I mean, I wanted to take a little bit a broad perspective and refer to the underlying issues that we can address either through ex-ante regulation, as the Digital Single Markets Act is to a large extent, or ex-post competition enforcement as the Greek law moves to that direction. And I would say that the main concerns that we see relate to exactly the ability of some ecosystems, that they have some central intermediaries in the center to lock in their users. So we have different sides of users. We have suppliers of products and services. Jeff and Michael gave examples: advertisers, app developers, external producers. And we have on the other side the demand, the consumers that they visit ecosystems to find a variety and quality of supply. And of course, when we have central intermediaries that facilitate the interaction between supply and demands, there are particular issues that emerge when we have a combination of specific forces in place. And those forces vary from network effects by participating in this ecosystem and by visit the intermediary extract extra value because many other users visit that intermediary. But also at the same time, we have the data accumulation, especially in digital ecosystems, where since the condition to visit these intermediaries is to share with them data which is analyzed with artificial intelligence technologies and machine learning, which basically make the intermediary services more efficient. And on the one side, better matching algorithms, I can easier find what I'm looking in the ecosystem. But on the other side, it also increases the asymmetric information in this ecosystem. So a combination of network effects and this asymmetric information makes users to rely more on the intermediary for their online presence and activities. There is the risk in this case when I rely a lot, when I'm locked in this intermediary, especially in specific markets that economies of scale and scope are also important. We see the emergence of some intermediaries which have the ability to extract more ends from their users for the provision of services. And the users, they don't have alternative options because these intermediaries know them very well. They can offer them what they want. So they have, and also they know that through this intermediary, they will find sufficient interactions on the other side in order to sell or consume products and services. And therefore, not having this alternative choice and options, we see that they give in to these conditions that are imposed by the intermediaries that in order to extract more range from their users. And that, I think, is the first important fundamental problem that has been identified at the European level, and the Digital Markets Act has this as one of the main motives. You mentioned also some member states, but we could go beyond that. We see that such discussions and concerns have been discussed intensively in the US, in China, in other jurisdictions. So we see that we have a common agreement on some specific concerns that exist in ecosystem with big central intermediaries, which have the advantage of information, and they are benefited by network effects and economies of scale in imposing specific conditions to their benefit in the expense of their users. So this is one specific risk. There is an additional risk that we should consider, that these intermediaries in many cases do not only provide intermediary services, they also are active in the ecosystem by supplying their own goods and services. And then the second concerns that arrive from this vertically integrated structure is probably the promotion of the intermediary of its own services and products in the expense on its competitors and other business users. So I would say that these two fundamental concerns are the ones that we should think very critically how to address. And one way, and I appreciate Frederic's points on regulation and competition enforcement, is to go through regulation. The other is to go through competition law enforcement. I'm more of the opinion that we need both. We need a harmonic combination of ex-ante regulation and ex-post competition enforcement. I don't believe that ex-post competition enforcement can solve the problem of not having competition between different ecosystems in which users can find or supply substitutable services. There we need some form of ex-ante regulation that will target to increase the competition. Ex-post enforcement, of course, can be very important and helpful on restoring the value, the distribution of value within an ecosystem, so that the central intermediary does not extract excessive rents. Going to the Digital Markets Act, I believe that it provides an ex-ante framework in removing unfair conditions that allow the central intermediaries to collect excessive rents. But also it has some provisions on trying to create more competition across different ecosystems by allowing some form of data access and portability, reducing the asymmetric information across the different ecosystems, especially in cases that we have one ecosystem with a central intermediary that has access to much more data and information than intermediaries in competing ecosystems. I mean, Jeff mentioned that we are working on this issue, and actually we provide some ideas on how we can make this data information sharing work in a more effective way than it currently works, or as it is incorporated in the rules of the DMA. I would like to spend some time before going to that, if I have time, in the end of the Greek law. I believe that the Greek law follows this harmonic coordination and combination with the DMA. I think that it also addresses some of the critical points of the DMA. And I mean, in the Article 2A, for example, in paragraph 2, it becomes clear that business model specificities of the ecosystem should be taken into account. And as Ioannis mentioned, we need to have this objective justification, which is a cornerstone in competition law for moving forward. The burden of proof, again, I agree that should be reversed in order to also address some of the problems that we had in the past in competition enforcement. To some extent, competition enforcement has been too slow in addressing the concerns of digital markets, exactly because we had to move forward by asking also the big intermediaries, the big platforms, to provide some objective justification for their actions in order to save time and move forward to the analysis of the cases. So I think that this business model characteristics is a very important and welcome provision to be there, and I'm happy to see it. I would like to note that on the definition of this position power, I fully take into account the remark by Frederic on this negotiation versus market power, and this is something to think more. But what I see on the criteria for this position power are basically criteria that through the discussions, through the debates among competition experts and enforcers are to more or less criteria that you expect to play an important role in the definition of the position power. And we have seen, for example, the German law, and we can make a direct comparison of this criteria on the platforms of paramount significance there. We have seen the DMA that has some quantitative criteria, but I think the underlying message, and this is another extension that I'm happy to see in the Greek law, is exactly to go to the dimension where we investigate where users have alternative choices or they are locked in on particular ecosystems and with central intermediaries. So I see that paragraph 5 on the position of the power moves to this direction, and that is important. Of course, I'm looking forward to see the implementation phase of this article, but on first sight, it moves to the correct direction. It addresses concerns that should be addressed, and there is a common agreement that in specific ecosystems we have such concerns, and this common agreement goes, as I said, beyond European Union and member states, goes also to other jurisdictions. I'm personally in favor of going to the direction of behavioral remedies and not to the direction that it is currently discussed in the US, for example, by breaking up platforms and big platforms and big tech. And I would say that a harmonic combination of ex-ante rules and ex-post enforcement requires some additional elements on the ex-ante regulation side that will make will induce greater competition among ecosystems, and this is an important dimension. And I think creating and establishing an effective information sharing mechanism across the ecosystems that also induce more choice from the user side to visit different ecosystems will be essential to move forward. I will stop here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, George. Bruno hasn't joined us yet. Hopefully he'll be joining us soon. So I will then turn to Konstantinos Stylianou to come in and provide his own insights from what he has been doing with, as I know, Nicolo Zingales on ecosystems. Konstantinos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ioannis, and thanks everyone for being here, and thanks everyone who is tuning in to listen to what we have to say from this tiny country in the Mediterranean with this global first provision to harness ecosystems. I mean, being Greek myself and having been part of this effort to make this into law, it's great to see a country as small as Greece to come forward with this novelty. It stands to show that smaller markets can be more agile and more flexible and more daring, and this is good to see. It reminds me of El Salvador, which was the first country to make Bitcoin legal tender, and it's the kind of things that you don't really see, you don't really expect from large established markets. So I suppose that Greece is a good place to try out such a new provision. So it's great to see. The first thing that I want to comment on is, and Ioannis already alluded to it, but the first thing that I think it's important for us to note is the reason why this has been an important provision, like the gap that is filling. And while this law was being contemplated, perhaps the strongest resistance was on why do we even need a specific provision on ecosystems, and the reasons that came up, the arguments that came up were that we already have the tools needed. We have the concept of aftermarkets. Now, the problem with aftermarkets is that in the context they were developed, they concerned durable goods with consumables. There was a time lag between when each product was purchased, and so the concept of aftermarkets does not fully describe ecosystems. Then the pushback was that we have platforms, and competition law has integrated platforms into scholarly analysis and case law, and this is true. But platforms, the way that they have dealt within competition law so far, mainly focuses on transactional platforms, and they concern either the effect of network effects or the pricing game that the platform sponsor will play. But they don't really expand into any other aspects that we see in ecosystems, and primarily the fact that the ecosystem sponsor is not just the platform commonly, but they are present in many of the markets around the platform, and they can specify the relationships and details of more than just the price, but rather pretty much how everything works on the ecosystem. So platforms don't fully cover ecosystems as well. And then other arguments came up, like, for example, that case law like the Petropoulos case allows us to establish dominance and abuse in a certain market, but then look for the results in a different market. And this is also something that we normally see in ecosystem. It's part of why we want to do ecosystem analysis. But with ecosystems, this tends to take place at multiple markets rather than in the context of, say, the Petropoulos case, which was, here's a market where the abuse happened, and here's the market where the effect happened. And it's quite a simpler model. And so when we take all of those kind of like gaps here and there from the existing tools together, and we see that we have something that we can borrow from one tool and a different concept from another tool and so on, and put them together, sure, we can still make do with what we have. But you know what? When something looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, walks like a duck, let's give it a proper name and deal with it properly. And this is where the dedicated competition ecosystem provision came to be. Now, the law itself is, I mean, you will have seen, for those of you who read it, it's complicated. It's difficult to try to respond to pretty much like all of those objections to the law in one place. And you want the law to be general enough to apply in various circumstances, but also specific enough to not go beyond what's needed. And so a lot of compromise has gone into the current shape of the law, and it does make for a very complex and complicated read. Now, I can assure you it sounds better in Greek. The version that you have is the translation. It definitely sounds better in Greek. Then again, everything sounds better in Greek. But it is a compromise of all those like different forces that we have tried to put together. Now, moving from that, I have my own personal kind of like views in terms of like things that might be improved for a market as small as Greece, perhaps, you know, for ecosystems to break the to reverse the burden of proof that an ecosystem has dominant power might be enough. Perhaps we could do away with 3. Perhaps the presumption that if non-participation significantly makes things harder for a third party, perhaps that's a very strong presumption. But these details can be ironed out. The important thing that I think that we have to focus on now, because the devil, after all, is in the details, is how do we operationalize this provision? The difficulty now is to take what the law says, those 2 or 3 paragraphs, and in the guidelines, make sure that there is a cohesive framework for analysis. And the reason why I think this is important is because this provision, particularly against the backdrop of all of the objections that have been raised against it, it does not function in vacuum. It has to make maximum use of the existing analytical framework of competition law. So the Greek competition authority, but any other competition authority that wants to lead, to take the example of competition of the Greek competition authority, will have to try as much as possible to integrate the existing provision into what we already do and know in competition law. And in that vein, part of what we are trying to do with Nicolo is to try to operationalize this provision by moving onto mapping all of the new things that we know about ecosystems into the existing analytical framework of abuse of dominance in ecosystems. Now, if I may share just one slide. So I am going to share one window and one slide only. And if you can see, what we've been trying to do here is basically take the existing framework, which is we're looking for a source of economic power. Why does the actor that we are challenging and we are go against, why do we think that they have market power? This is the 3rd column in this framework. And we try to take that source of economic power and link it to ecosystem characteristics and to how to measure those. Now, the one thing that we try to do is to remove ecosystem characteristics that are, we don't deny are relevant and we don't deny that apply in ecosystems, but we think that they apply in so many other situations outside of ecosystems that if we want to really focus on the reason why we want to adopt a new framework for ecosystems, we need to remove them to increase clarity. And so you will see that we don't really talk about platforms here at all. And the reason for that is because platforms has been so well developed in computational analysis so far that if the problem in an ecosystem revolves around its function as a platform and perhaps how much it charges, we don't really have to rely on this on the new provision. And this is why, as Ioannis has said, in the provision we included an exception to say that if the situation we're going after can be well dealt within 102 or Article 2 of the Greek competition law, then so be it. So if the platform elements are what we go after, then we don't really need that. So you can see that we don't focus so much on, say, the platform characteristics of ecosystems, not because we don't think that they're there, but because we want to focus only on those characteristics of ecosystems that make them really unique, that go beyond what we now understand as platforms. And so, firstly, on top of removing certain elements, we add new elements that we believe that we haven't been fully explored in ecosystems. And perhaps the most important of those is, if you look in the second column where it says ecosystem characteristics, the second one of them that says the fluidity of the focal point, which is that the focus of the ecosystem can change but still remain within the boundaries of that ecosystem. And we think that this is very important because the trap here for authorities is that they may focus on, say, one bottleneck in the ecosystem where power is exercised, but because the ecosystem sponsor is present in other areas within the ecosystem, they can shift that bottleneck power from one element to another element before a competition authority has had the opportunity to resolve the case to completion. And the example that we use for that is the app stores, basically. So over the past 10 years, competition authorities have been kept busy.
I think we might have a connection issue with Konstantinos, or at least I have. So what I suggest is to maybe move to Nicholas Economides' presentation. Nicholas, I think, is online. So, Nicola?
Yeah. I would be happy to speak, but because of connection problems, I might take my face off. For my video off, but
yes, for the time being, we're fine with that. So you can move ahead.
All right.
Face on, and if we see problems, I'll let you know.
All right. Okay. Very good. So my remarks are very limited, I guess I should start by discuss such a provision. So why do we need abuse of dominance in an ecosystem versus abuse of dominance in the market, which is a traditional way we approach this? And the main idea here is that there could be situations in which a company is not dominant in any particular market, but at the same time, if you look at the whole ecosystem, it looks like it plays a dominant role. So what does it mean to play a dominant role in the ecosystem? And I'm not talking really about two-sided platforms here, but something like an ecosystem which is not necessarily a two-sided platform. So how can it be that this company is able to have so much power, even though it's not dominant in any particular market? Well, it's possible that this company is able to define the terms of competition in adjacent markets. That means in complementary goods. How could it do that? For example, it could control the interfaces, the way that the complementary goods connect with the main good. Let's say if we have component A and component B, it's possible that component A is controlled by a company that is able to define the interface and the terms of competition in which component B connects. And that means that company A can set up ways in which the firms interconnect. So suddenly the problem goes away from one market, the market for A, in which A participates, and goes to be a bigger problem in which we look at systems. For example, A plus B, component A plus component B together. And we should, and that really takes us away from traditional competition approaches, market-based approaches, because we're going to systems and combinations of components. I noticed one of the earlier speakers talked about multi-level entry. That can be important in this setup. How far do competing companies need to go, not to compete in the markets that A participates, but in creating a whole alternative ecosystems? I would have to disagree a bit with Konstantinos. I don't think that the market for platforms has been so well developed in competition law, but more than for ecosystems, but we're not completely there in terms of an analysis of markets with network effects. So what I was trying to say, and maybe I'll say it in a couple of summary ways, is that when we look at abuse of dominance in an ecosystem, it must be because there is more intricate stuff than what happens in an abuse of dominance in markets. For example, control of interfaces, prevention of multi-level entry, the fluidity of the focal point that Konstantinos was talking about right before he got interrupted. And, looking more generally beyond markets. I think that that's important, and that's important also in the antitrust suits that have been brought by the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission against Google and Facebook. There has been an approach by American politicians that breakup is the best solution. That's the way we're going to go forward. But I think that when you have these ecosystems and platforms, you have to see that network effects play a role that is beneficial for consumers and, of course, beneficial for the dominant firms. So we have to find a way so that consumers are not hurt in any situation in which we would need a remedy. So we have to find ways in which network effects and even the ecosystem are preserved. So how can we do that in the setup that we're discussing? We can do that by creating interoperability, imposing interoperability, so that, in fact, network effects are preserved and they're not killed, and at the same time, competition increases. So that's important. I think it's very important because I see the politicians say, let's break up the companies. Let's make sure that if you have a marketplace, you cannot have your own products and so on and so on. And that approach has been pushed very hard in the United States. But I think that that kind of approach can be in the end counterproductive. We need to be able to preserve network effects and to preserve the ecosystems, while at the same time intervening probably in a more delicate way and finding ways in which competition can increase without killing network effects and the benefits of interoperability. So these are my very short remarks. I will be very happy to discuss questions in a few minutes, and I see that the connection now is better, so I can put my face up.
Let me before give back the floor to Konstantinos to conclude, because he was interrupted. So firstly, it's great that you bring in the idea that we're facing a complexity here of a system. So, and the non-linearity that we see in, as opposed to linearity that we see in market economics, I mean, the non-linearity of system, ecosystem, let's say, economics, and I think this is quite important. Now, just a question for you. I mean, you mentioned the US and the debate there, and the fact that this concern about bigness has led some to to argue for to break up the various companies. Now, in Greece, we don't really face this type of backlash. It's actually the opposite side. It's, are we not going to affect the incentives of investors to come to Greece by having such a provision like the one that we're suggesting in this law? And of course, what would be your perspective on that and the utility of this provision in order, as Michael mentioned before, to attract basically investment in particular and help the investor, the incentives for complementers, but also platforms to develop in Greece. I mean, what would be your perspective? And here, we're not talking about the classic digital ecosystem. It can be about the tourism. It can be about banking. It can be about basically broader areas which could be of interest for the economy of the country. So I don't know if you'd like to say a few words about that.
I can. Sure. I mean, the American version of we need more investment and let us do anything we want. We have encountered it in essentially in every case against the monopoly in the United States, in which the monopoly says, well, if you do the stuff that you say you should do, then we will have lower profits and we won't be able to invest. This was the standard line of AT&T in the 70s, and when it was facing an antitrust suit which eventually broke it up, for example. This is that we have, remember the word supermodularity. Supermodularity, you guys are too young to remember it. Supermodularity meant that we produce 50 products, but if you break us in pieces like between long distance and local, then the benefits of cost reduction synergies between the two services would disappear, and therefore we would not be able to. You're creating some loss to society. So in a similar way, I would say to the Greek government that if people have interest in innovative products, and Greece is really the best fit for such investments, they will not really be thwarted by enforcement of competition law. And that's kind of a general in principle idea that when we attract, we as Greeks, let's say, attract investments, it doesn't mean that we give people the opportunity to break any law that we have. So it's very important to have competition law so that the consumers are protected, and it's very important to have this law also so that businesses are protected. You don't want somebody to just come and take over a whole sector. So sometimes, if I should say, there might be cases in which we have to be very careful about being very nimble with competition law. But in general, the argument that we should kind of restrict competition law because we want to attract large investments is just wrong. I mean, I think that it's misleading, politicians also have to be educated in competition law, so that they see that competition authorities are not acting against the best interests of the country, but in fact are acting in the best interest of the country. And that's kind of a general idea. I mean, it's not just on ecosystems. Now, since this idea of ecosystem is relatively new, again, we should be careful how it's going to be enforced, because we don't want it to be killed by being enforced in the wrong way. Okay, sorry, I'm taking away time from Konstantinos. Sorry, I'm talking a bit too much.
And I see also Frederic might want to intervene on this issue. Probably, I don't know. I just see you nodding, Frederic. So I guess that you like to talk about that. So you have a couple of short remarks before I give the floor to Konstantinos, or am I pushing it? Yeah.
Okay. I mean, first, I sympathize with what was just said, because in the trade field, we've heard the same thing for many years on the part of a number of countries, particularly developing countries that didn't have a competition law. Or we don't want to have a competition law, because if we have one, there are going to be fewer investments from multinationals in our country. I think that UNCTAD has done an excellent job, and the investment division of UNCTAD has done an excellent job to say that this was just wrong as an argument, that in fact firms like to have a fairly precise and fairly predictable regulatory system. And so I think that in the case of Greece and in the case of the amendment there, what would help would be to tell the historical facts that have just been mentioned to legislators. But the second thing, it's quite clear that if there was no particular amendment to the law, what would be the alternatives? There would be some kind of regulation, which presumably would be much less detailed and much less with much bigger risk of mistakes. So that's one side. Or on the other side, competition authorities doing what they have been doing, I must say, in the past, which is using their arsenal in completely unpredictable ways. And if you take, I don't know, the German case on information and data and privacy, Facebook case, it could not have been anticipated by Facebook that there would be this kind of interpretation of the competition law. As a matter of fact, could not, it's still debatable whether it was a proper interpretation of competition law. Firms don't like that kind of uncertainty. So if you commit yourself to writing guidelines on how you're going to implement this, how you're going to define market power, how you're going to define, I think it's going to be a big step in favor of those firms, because that will bring some clarity on what the issues are going to be and some predictability for them. And so I don't think that investment is really in danger in this case.
Thank you very much, Frederic. And as actually Konstantinos, to which I will give the floor to conclude, said before, I mean, this was a very bumpy journey in transposing this idea of ecosystem in a legislative text, which is much more difficult to write than guidelines, I can assure you, because there's a very specific word limit. You cannot actually do very long legislation. It has to be somehow understandable, and also it has to provide definitions which can be crispy, but at the same time provide some flexibility, because you don't draft legislation for 6 months or a year, but you want this legislation to be there for a significant period of time. So I would say that it's the effort of writing this legislation has been arduous in order to take into account the various concerns that have been expressed during this bumpy journey. We actually tried very much to take into account all the various concerns also expressed by businesses, by consumer associations, And of course, it cannot be any perfect legal text, and we definitely don't claim that this is a perfect text. But again, that has been a long effort that has been undertaken, and obviously any type of improvement through the guidelines of, let's say, providing more precision will be definitely welcome, because obviously guidelines are there for that, and guidelines offer some more flexibility than the legislative text. We cannot actually, because I mentioned that because I don't want to be asked to in another round to add more things into the text so as to make it more predictable, because obviously, there's up to a certain point you can arrive in terms of predictability in a legislative text. Otherwise, it's not a legislative text, and it's actually drafting guidelines. And I think that both are important and necessary, and complements. So I give the floor to Konstantinos. I think Bruno might have issues to join us in terms of technical issues. Konstantinos, the floor is yours. If you'd like to continue your contribution, and hopefully if Bruno can join us, he could have 5 to 10 minutes to present his insights on the concept of ecosystem power and the work we have been doing together on developing metrics for that. So Konstantinos, the floor is yours.
Right. Thanks and apologies. So the only thing that I just wanted to put out as a message was that I think it's important that in the guidelines and generally competition authorities, they make an effort to link ecosystem characteristics to why those characteristics create market power for them, to how this market power can be exploited, to how this market power can be measured. Without this kind of correspondence between each element, I'm afraid what's going to happen is that we lump together a number of characteristics of ecosystems without, however, specifying why each one specifically makes ecosystems a unique thing, as opposed to, say, just platforms or two-sided markets or whatever other similar concepts we have. And so without this correspondence, we don't link the characteristics that we identify with that situation to how those characteristics result into market power. And I think that part of what we're trying to do with Nicolo in that framework is not only to focus on the ecosystem specific characteristics as opposed to just platforms or other related concepts, but also link each individual characteristics to how we think it contributes to them having market power. And the one thing missing, and I was just concluding with that when I was interrupted, the one thing missing, I think, is this idea that because ecosystems are present in multiple markets, because they have the power to shape the relationships across those markets, because they can exploit synergies for themselves and economies of scope in particular, and because they've generally contributed to building the ecosystems, and therefore they have an abstract understanding that is superior to any other actor in the ecosystem, this gives them the power to move around the bottleneck points. And I think that this is happening now with all these giant players moving the bottleneck from app stores to voice assistants. Now, app stores used to be the bottleneck that controlled all of the applications that we installed, and then it expanded into all the transactions that we do in those applications in the ecosystem. But the potential of voice control and voice assistants is that they link us to even more services. They link us to search. They link us to completely different devices, including our car, thermostats in our home, fridges, voice assistants in the kitchen to look up recipes and so on. So they provide a much more expansive entry point into their ecosystem. And these ecosystem sponsors, they are pretty much the only actors in the ecosystem that can leverage all of the characteristics that we list in our framework to be able to move the bottleneck from app stores to a different point. And by the time authorities have completed the investigation against app stores, they've moved down onto another bottleneck position in the ecosystem. And I think that this is an important thing for competition authorities to proactive on and monitor. So yeah, that's from me, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. And of course, we have seen in the internet the move from browsers to app stores, and now, as you say, to voice assistants as points of bottleneck. And of course, when we think about ecosystems, we can think about the merging of various sectors previously considered separate. For instance, next week we have a hearing here, the Greek Competition Authority on insurance and healthcare as basically forming now one broader ecosystem through the use of data. And I mean, I think we're just seeing important summations. And I'd like just to have a last round of comments from each of you. You would like to discuss one of the points that was made before, or would like to make a different point? Maybe start with Jeff Parker, probably. Jeff, I don't know if you like to take the floor.
Well, mostly I'm just going to echo, I think, Nicholas's point is one that we share, which is just this sources of value and, just needing to be very careful about network effects in particular and data aggregation in particular, and just not destroying those. But I also appreciated his point that this idea that investment was going to be harmed, you have to take that with a grain of salt. So, by the way, Nicholas, I think I had supermodularity on my general exams, so I am that old.
And I see now Bruno has joined us, so I'll give him the floor in 1 minute
Okay. I just wanted to echo Konstantinos. I think this voice layer, I just think that is absolutely fascinating in how the control points shift. And there's sort of this ever evolving landscape of how they're able to control point after point. And then behind it, you've got all of these different services and connections. And I appreciated your graph that showed there are really only a handful of firms on planet Earth. And we should add the Alibaba's 10 cents and a little bit Baidu, that could bring that full range of capabilities and services and actually have competition in that kind of broad front.
So this is one of the points we also make here to the businesses, that basically they are all, even the biggest one of those, complementers actually in the new world. So in a way, I think this may not be completely understood yet, but it's actually true. Not only in small countries like Greece, but also bigger countries like Germany. Think about the automobile industry and how they can actually end up being complementers in the.
Actually, that raises a really interesting point, because if you look at what's happening now, kind of as fallout from the trade war between the U.S. and China, you've got this potential for a kind of a bifurcation where data has to reside either in the Western bloc, if you will, or in the Eastern bloc. And then your point about the German manufacturers, Siemens and Daimler and BMW and the rest, is they've got these global supply chains. And so now they're having to figure out, how do I rapidly reconfigure in response to these regulations? So it actually goes beyond the competition laws, and you can have huge impacts literally on global supply chains, which didn't used to be sexy, but in the last couple of years, people have been much more interested in where their stuff comes from.
Oh, that's absolutely great. Let me give the floor to Bruno. Bruno, hello, thank you very much. I know you had another meeting of the GRC that you had to present, and we thank you very much for taking the time to join us. So the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, and sorry for the delay. Sorry, since I missed the first part of the discussion, how do you want to go about it? Like, continue discussion on specific topic?
I think the idea was that you might want to present about the concept of ecosystem power and the work we have been doing together on this, or on your own as well, because you have been following up this work with colleagues at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. There has been a lot of work in this field. I mean, trying to figure out power in the context of ecosystem. I think this is the next frontier, I would say, of regulation and competition law. And maybe you'd like to say a few words about that.
Sure. Well, there's been work, let's say, on two fronts, theoretically and empirically. So the first one is, let's say, the concept of power that would be specific or more prominent in ecosystems. That's something we've been working on with Ioannis in a already published paper and as a working paper. I can talk a little bit of that, and it's maybe our empirical approach and focus on that, how to actually propose to measure one of these dimensions of power. The other work's been more on also rather empirical on how to, let's say, design the frontiers of ecosystems. So how to actually measure those demand-side complementarities. So we focus only on the demand-side complementarities and not on the supply-side ones. So regarding the first one, maybe I should share my screen. It's going to be easier. A little bit of visual support.
6-7 minutes for both. I mean, that would be really appreciated. Or even one. I mean, in case both are not possible. Yeah.
Sure. Well, so this regarding the notion of power, this draws from a paper we wrote with Ioannis. I'll give you the link in a minute. So the idea we're looking at different dimensions of power that could be applied to economic power, because it not only draws from economic and legal literature on antitrust, and we're focusing among those on the empirical side on two specific types of power that we think fit value chains and ecosystems in particular. So the first one is the idea of resource dependence. So the idea here is all these actors that have to cooperate to create joint value in an ecosystem. They have complementary resources, we know that, and well, the question is that they don't depend on each other to the same extent. Like they're all codependent, that's why they are in the same ecosystem, but some depend on some more than others. That's the basic idea. And so, okay, how could we actually measure that? And that's the second one for which we propose a measure, but we couldn't test it on real data, is this idea of panopticon power. So it's more about the position you have in the network. So a classic example would be Amazon and all the ecosystem of Amazon-related businesses, including the retailers. Or if you want to think of it as a supply chain where you have a retailer and suppliers are using the platform. Well, here's the position of Amazon as integrator that gives it all this information about the sales that not even the actual sellers have. And that's all the discussion with the DMA about separation of duties and all that you all know. Well, comes from this idea that you have a privileged position, usually the integrator of the ecosystem will have it, and that would give you, let's say, a bargaining power over your cooperators in the ecosystem. So regarding the first one, for which we did some work in the case of value chains, we developed this indicator that basically tries to measure how this differential dependency on each other's resources. So here we take a very traditional value chain for which we had actual real data from the Hellenic Competition Commission, Sector Inquiry and Supermarket. And so what is the idea? Well, I pass on you the details. You can read it in the paper more carefully on the computation, but it's pretty easy when you use a standard product. It would be the market shares of each. In this case, we have a simple value chain, suppliers that sell to supermarkets, so 2 tires. There we go. And each has a market share. So we have, for both the suppliers and the retailers. So we compute each market share, elevate it to the square, and we do the sum of all those. So we do the share of that as a sum of all these market shares to the square. And what this indicator gives us is, let's say graphically, it's related to a type of centrality in network theory, the between centrality. So the basic idea here, illustrated with this very simple example, is that compared to a simple market share, like say in the first case, you would say, well, we have a monopsony and a monopoly, one retailer, one supplier. Well, you'll say, well, the supplier has 100% of market share. So depending on how you look at it, each of these has equal bargaining power. I'm your only buyer, you're my only seller. So let's say in this case, they depend on each other's resources equally with a simple market share. With this indicator, the SSBC indicator, then if we go to another situation in which we have still one supplier, so still is a monopolist, but now we have like two retailers, and the two retailers sell exactly the same. They all buy the exact same share, so 50% of the market each. Well, in this case, the supplier is still a monopoly, still has 100% of the sales. But the interesting thing in this simple example is that the SSBC indicator, proposed indicator, would say has less bargaining power. Why? Because even though it's still a monopolist in terms of market shares, it depends the dependence they have on it is different. Now there's let me start again with the if you look at the retailers, now that they have they're more dependent on supplier one, because each of them has less bargaining power. They're not now the only buyers, so that makes it the supplier to have a bigger market power than in the first case. It's still a monopolist, but now you can pressure each of them more because they have less negotiation power, and that usually you cannot capture with a simple market share. So with this indicator, you can capture. You can say, okay, even with the same market share, 100%, the supplier now has more power because it can. They are more dependent on his resource, in this case, whatever he's selling, than it was in a case where there was a monopsony. So that's the basic idea of indicator. And obviously, with this, would like, if we could find some real data, to apply this to other types of exchanges of resources. It could be in a digital ecosystem. It could be in data exchanges, for example, where you can see, okay, which one depends on whose data more than other. So we apply this just to illustrate it. We can represent it as a network. And the big nodes are the ones that have more power in this indicator, and then you can actually check for the differences between what you would get if you apply a simple market share and if you apply this indicator. So that's the gist of the indicator. We applied it to a value chain for ecosystems. It still applies. So you can still think of important things. Okay, you have to define the resources in plural that you would be looking at. But you could compute this same indicator as long as you have some numeric variable for that indicator of resources that are being exchanged in the ecosystem. Which takes us to the second point. So this is a longer point. Just going to tell you like the gist of it, and we can discuss it. The idea is, okay, how do you actually measure where the ecosystem starts and where it ends? Here we're talking about a supply chain where supermarkets sell to, where supermarkets buy from suppliers. But obviously, in the ecosystems, the frontiers are not so easily defined. You can say, okay, this app is part of the ecosystem because it's in the App Store. But in other more complex ecosystems like mobility, you can say, okay, are they actually in or out of the ecosystem? So the first way would be to say, okay, from a supply side perspective, it's maybe more intuitive. You say, okay, this resource is complementary with this other in a non-generic way. But then on the demand side, how do you measure whether these consumers actually have these complementarities that are non-generic, and non-generic being the key part of this definition? Because otherwise you could just apply a typical test to see the cross-price elasticities and see if they're complementary products. So this paper we've been working on, I can send you a working paper version. I will also not publish on the tube. The idea is to say, okay, well, we look at platforms. We take that as, okay, a platform ecosystem. And we take the biggest platforms of all types, like Airbnb and Amazon, Gmail, all these types of platforms. And what we do is we try to measure ecosystems as a specific type of traffic. We have data on the cross traffic between the platform. And the basic idea is saying, okay, of all the traffic that platforms send to each other, the one that actually translates is non-generic complementarities would be the referral traffic, saying the traffic where there's actually a link inserted on purpose in the website to go to another one that does not respond to advertisement or search. Like if you type on Google, yes, you're gonna find links of, if I type competition, I'm gonna get like a lot of websites that talk about competition, but that's organic search. That that is really pretty generic. It's like a highway to get anywhere. So we look at the types of traffic that we can find in this database, and we look at the one that is specifically put, let's say, on purpose with a specific site. So, for example, a price comparison tool that would give you other than advertisement and other search results will try to link you to an Amazon product because they checked your preferences and they know you like that. So they put that link on purpose for you, not as an advertisement, important, but just like something because they think you will buy it. So that's like, okay, they think, okay, my tool, my price comparison tool is complementary to your Amazon retailer. And then we check that and we use it to create a metric of demand-side complementarities. We look at which ones are statistically significant, because obviously if you click once, you're going to show up and there's a link between the two sites. But how much is too much? So we look at different statistics. And we say, okay, we'll find a cut. And then when we do find that cut, we say, okay, well, that could actually draw the frontiers of ecosystem, which would be kind of like an empirical, let's say, inductive way of doing this ecosystem definition, if I do the parallelism with market definition. Because, well, as you all know, the key thing is like a market definition cannot be measured in this case, or ecosystem definition cannot be done with the standard tools of market definition, because we're talking exactly about the contrary. It's not about substitute products, but about complementary products, but they have to be complementary in a non-generic way. Otherwise, everything that you can use together would be in the same ecosystem. So this is the way we wanted to measure on the demand side, and we find like very coherent results. We find like a tourism ecosystem. We find retail and related product ecosystems for European platforms. I think that's a first step into say, okay, if we actually want to do antitrust regulation of ecosystems, well, that will be a first way to delineate where the ecosystem starts on the demand side. Then obviously you can put more theory or qualitative data into the supply side, saying, okay, this product is actually made complementary with this, like this app is made for this type of smart TV, so I'm going to put it in the ecosystem. So, this second thing I briefly talked about is how could you actually delineate the ecosystem empirically on the demand side to start doing your analysis. And once you have delineated the ecosystem, you can say, okay, who has more power, and try to apply this other indicator and say, okay, well, now we can actually measure who depends on whom more in terms of resources.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And from my perspective, this shows that there's much work that has already been done. First on identifying, power in ecosystems, and of course we can move away just from this binary relationship, kind of most simple relation of a value chain of input and output related segments to an ecosystem which has a lot of conglomerate, basically, type of relations. And of course, as Fred mentioned, and I replied to Fred before, it's not just about bargaining power. Because this is a binary relationship. You have to take a positional power perspective, which will need to rely on broader tools. And then very interesting, the point that Bruno made about the metrics for delineating ecosystem. The same way we have been using the SSNIP test or price correlation test in order to identify what is a market, a relevant market. The same way, we can rely both on qualitative but also quantitative tests to identify what is an ecosystem. And I think that would be very nice addition to the guidelines that we could probably develop in the context of Article 2A to also suggest a number of metrics and tools, quantitative tools to measure what is really, what are the borders, the frontiers of ecosystems, delineate ecosystems. I just want to, we have maybe 5-10 minutes to finalize. I don't know if there are any comments from the speakers. Otherwise, we can finish a bit earlier. Any comments or no? I think.
Yeah, sorry. I would like to ask a question really on the last presentation. I want to understand better how does this measure relate to bargaining power and traditional kind of bargaining models, because this here you're not just operationalize something. You're proposing a completely new theory of bargaining based on network relationships. So I think I would like to see much more on it from a theoretical side, not from the empirical implementation thing, which I'm sure it's easy to do given the formula. But more needs to be said about. And I would like Bruno and Ioannis and whoever else is involved in this research to work more on this type of connection between this formulaic approach and the traditional bargaining, which has been around for a long time.
I mean, this is something we look a little bit in our paper. I mean, I will send it to you, maybe haven't yet, which somehow takes the social exchange theory type of perspective. I mean, a more sociological perspective. It brings these type of insights into bargaining, but more broadly, I would say, into resource dependence. In a way, market power could be also conceived as a sort of resource dependence. It can be analyzed that way. I mean, this is a lot of work in also economic sociology about this. So, and I think one of the potentialities of the ecosystem concept, is that we can bring in research and insights, not just from economics, but also from other social sciences that have been doing work in this area, and in particular, I was thinking about cognitive sociology, which could be of relevance. So we need to add up, and I think George wants to have a question or maybe make a point.
Yeah. Question to this paper. I think it's very interesting. So have you thought also to look, because at big ecosystems, one of the concerns is how to address mergers and how to update merger policy. Have you thought to apply this bargaining measure on specific mergers that have already happened, and to see whether the implications would have been different from the ones by using the market share measure?
That's a very interesting point.
Yeah.
We haven't yet, but definitely something to do. Bruno, would like to add?
No, actually, that's a great idea, and it would be even like a good way to apply it as a counterfactual. But the best thing would be to first try it with past mergers, and then if it works, try to use it as a counterfactual, check it against what happened after the merger. Even if we consider there has been obviously no remedies that have limited the exertion of his bargaining power, we would only need past data that has been used to assess the merger in the first place. So in this case, for example, if let's say we were trying to do a two suppliers merger, well, we would need the same type of data, who sold what to whom by how much, previous to the merger and after the merger, and we try to compute it. Yeah, that would be actually, that's a very good idea. Ioannis, as a president of the competition commission, if you have some data, I would love to try that.
Definitely try that. And I think, that shows the cross-fertilization that happen out of bringing in probably different conceptual frameworks. Actually, the paper is already on SSRN, and a new version will be added in the next couple of days, and it will appear at the Journal of Competition Law and Economics in the next issue, hopefully. Which unless there's any other remark or points, what I would like to do is to thank a lot our speakers and contributors. I think it was a very insightful discussion, full of interesting insights and critical points that will be taken into account. After all, what this new provision will do is to put forward the creation of an academic and competition authority ecosystem of cooperation in order to develop the guidelines and, of course, enforce this provision. If the political power to be or that is will decide to move ahead with this provision, which is something that I strongly hope for. So thank you very much again to our speakers, and thank you to our viewers as well. And looking forward to meeting you again in person once the COVID-19 issue will be finally resolved. Thank you very much. Goodbye from Athens.
Thank you.